have read my book and have already started working with men or women with same-sex attraction. So much of this material may feel basic to you, but I believe that we just need to be sure that the basic pieces are laid so that we are operating all from the same, using the same language and have some basic understanding. So I wanted to start with definitions, and this is very, very important in this day and age because the public and the media do not understand the complexity of homosexuality. So let's start. The first term that I want to introduce is same-sex attraction. And same-sex attraction is about the feelings, eroticized longing for closeness with the same sex. So, there are many women that I've worked with years who have same-sex feelings. They know they are drawn to other women and sometimes have sexual fantasies with the women, but more often than not, it's a desire to be held. It's a desire to be close, to look into the eyes of another woman. But many women have same-sex feelings, but have never acted on those feelings. And so they have not engaged in same-sex behavior. Same-sex behavior is when there's actual engagement in sexual activity with another woman, another female. And for some women, they believe that sexual fantasy is also an acting out, a behavior component. So, in our crazy world that we live in now, there are women, at least in the United States, there are young women who are kissing each other and hugging each other, not because they have same-sex attraction, but because they want to arouse the young boys. So we see more and more girls having same-sex behaviors or entering into same-sex behaviors for just because it's fun or because exploring sex with both genders makes you popular, it's cool. But these girls do not have an underlying same-sex attraction. However, when any person engages in behavior that may lead to sexual arousal, we may begin to create a pattern. You know, our brains are interested, we have experiences, and we begin to make a neural pathway, so to speak. And so these young women, if they keep engaging in the pattern of same-sex behavior or sexual arousal, may actually be creating a pathway that leads to more and more of that behavior. And it's very possible that these young women then at some point might say, I'm lesbian. Because now I'm wanting that. I'm wanting to be sexually involved with women. So that is, in fact, one possible pathway to experiencing same-sex attraction, but I think it's much more pertinent to this young generation, not necessarily to women who are older. So another separate construct is sexual identity. And this is the label with which people describe themselves in terms of their sexuality or their sexual preference. So this is when they will say, I am lesbian, or I am gay, or I am bisexual. For many, many years, I worked with women. Most of the women that I worked with said, Janelle, I do not like the word lesbian. I'm not going to call myself lesbian. I am not going to call myself homosexual. I do not believe this is how God created me, and so I am heterosexual. My identity is heterosexual. Now, when young people are coming into our clinic, again, as faith-based kids who have grown up in Christian homes, they say, they take on a sexual identity label such as, I am gay, I am lesbian, this is who I think I am, it feels like who I am. So just that creates difference, doesn't it, in how you might start approaching working with a young person versus working with a woman who comes in and says, I do not identify with my same-sex attraction at all. I will not let my sexuality define ultimately who I am. So you've already gotten kind of a little bit more of a platform to now objectively talk about her same-sex attraction or her homosexuality. But when you have a young person who comes in and says, this is who I am, and they may actually have some sense of pride, this is very different. We become very unsure of how to proceed with a person like this because many of these teenagers or adolescents say, I don't know as if I want to change. I think I'm okay with being lesbian. But they are very unhappy in their life. And so we say, okay, but let's work on what makes you unhappy. Let's work on what you do want to address and look at in therapy. We honor where they're at. We never coerce or push anybody to say, oh, you must want to change your homosexuality. We do not do that. We meet the person where they're at so that we can build trust. And we can work on parts of their lives that really do need possibly some support, some healing, some change, and maybe a year down the road, they will have different thoughts about their same-sex attraction. And they may say, I want to explore more. I want to understand why I have same-sex attraction. But I still don't know if I want to change. And we say, okay, let's work to understanding your same-sex attraction and talking more about when you first started noticing it and unpacking it, so to speak. So many people also have a public sexual identity, and what they want other people to see is heterosexuality. So they will not publicly say, I am gay or lesbian. They will live in ways that send off the message they are heterosexual. This is true for many, many people. But when you're in a safe place and a place that's confidential, these people will say, really, Janelle, inside, I think I'm gay. I think I'm lesbian. So it's important as counselors that we're always just waiting for the client to disclose. We never want to force a disclosure. There's been times when I've worked with women in counseling and they came in to work with me on their depression and anxiety, and I had a strong suspicion that they may have same-sex attraction, but I never mentioned it. In fact, we worked for 1.5 years before they finally said, and there is something else I want to work on. I have same-sex attraction. So I always allow my client to disclose on the level that they feel comfortable on anything in their life. So this is the most interesting thing I find about this field, and in terms of the media and some of the scientific literature. We hear all this discussion about sexual orientation, that sexual orientation is this stable construct in an individual's life that cannot change. And then, of course, we hear that sexual orientation can change. We can change somebody's sexual orientation. And I react to both of those statements. Because the concept of sexual orientation is just that. It's an abstract construct. and look at how it's defined in the literature. Sexual orientation is the pattern with which a person experiences sexual attraction, sexual behavior, sexual fantasy, and how they identify sexually. So, what researchers do is that they, in a variety of ways, they attempt to measure to what degree does a person have same-sex attraction? To what degree does a person have other sex attraction? To what degree does a person have same-sex behavior? To what degree do they also have other sex behavior? To what degree does a person identify themselves as lesbian or gay versus do they identify themselves as heterosexual or perhaps unlabeled? So after we gather all this information, if the person primarily has same-sex attraction or same-sex behavior and labels themselves as a sexual minority or a lesbian or gay, then they have a homosexual orientation. Do you hear the subjectivity in that? This is extremely subjective when we are attempting to measure a person's sexual orientation. So not only does that tell us that every individual is unique. Every individual is unique in terms of their same-sex feelings, how intense they are, how frequently they are, how many people they have had feelings for, the nature of behaviors, again, how frequent they are. The label itself, does the label change? You can just see every person is so unique in terms of their sexuality. So research has started in the last several years exploring whether or not sexual orientation, as we define it, is indeed stable and unchangeable. And what we've discovered, and these are not researchers, these are gay researchers. These are not researchers who are researching whether therapy can change, okay? That's not the research. The research is, do these components change just spontaneously? And they've realized that yes, in fact they do. People's feelings often change. Our feelings are sometimes can be incredibly intense, and then sometimes not. They've discovered that this is especially done with young adults. Young adults change their sexual behaviors. Sexual behaviors do change across the lifespan. And what was really interesting is that they have found that young adults tend to change their sexual identity label. So one day, a young girl may say, I'm gay, that's who I am. And then 3 weeks later, come into my office and say, I've decided I'm bisexual, Janelle. I think I'm bisexual. And then 3 weeks later, come in and say, you know what? I don't know about bisexual. I think I'm unlabeled. I think right now I'm not going to label myself. I'm just going to keep myself open to possibilities. Okay, hear that? This is very, very common in the young people. And so the researchers are now saying, maybe, because look at the definition of sexual orientation. It's based on feelings, behaviors, identity label. And yet we see all of these components being fluid or changing. And so how can we say then that sexual orientation is this stable construct that never shifts inside of a person? It's illogical, and yet that's the world we live in. But I'm very happy that there are some researchers now who are challenging this notion and suggesting that if the constructs that define sexual orientation indeed are fluid or spontaneously shift or change, then maybe we should not conclude that sexual orientation is stable and immutable. some of the sexual minority is a new class that's been established in the United States, and it's a protected class of individuals. Sexual orientation is now a protected class, so that we're not allowed to discriminate. But sexual minority now includes a vast list of labels. So the labels that young people and older people are using to describe their sexuality, this is just the beginning. Bisexuality, gay, lesbian, curious, queer, questioning. And I'm not sure if you're hearing these labels in Poland or not, but you probably will if you're not yet. There's many, many more. So how people are calling themselves. So anybody who claims that they are non-heterosexual falls into this umbrella term now called sexual minority. Okay, and I've already said this. In the past, the religious folks that I've worked with tended to disidentify with their same-sex feelings and even their same-sex behaviors, and they still would call themselves heterosexual. But again, the youth, that is beginning to change. The youth seem to be far more apt to label themselves. Okay.